I just felt to the core of my soul that the world didn't need another drone company. There are plenty of drones out there, but the problem was
thousands of companies show up to sell their technology to the US Department of Defense each year. But so few will transition from proof of concept to true production across the valley of death. The select few who do, their stories are rarely told. Until now, I'm Noah Scheinbaum, and this is Crossing the Valley. Greg Davis is a Stanford engineer with years of experience in the aerospace and drone industries. He got his start working at NASA Ames Research Lab, where he coordinated flight simulation studies, before joining Lockheed Martin as a software engineer, and then working on a variety of small unmanned systems at Insitu. Today, he's the founder and CEO of Overwatch Imaging, the Hood River, Oregon-based, venture-backed geospatial imagery intelligence company. Overwatch is helping mission managers get information they need from a variety of different mission platforms to predict, anticipate, and create the best response. Greg joined me to talk about his background, what it's like building a startup in Oregon, and Overwatch Imaging's journey across the many valleys of death in its path. Enjoy. All right, everybody, welcome back to Crossing the Valley. My guest today is the founder and CEO of Overwatch Imaging, Greg Davis. Greg, it's great to have you. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Noah. Great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Greg, Overwatch is a really cool story. It's a little bit different than some of the companies we've had on here recently, which I love. You come from a different background than many of the founders we've featured. So I want to start with you. Give us the Greg Davis story. Why are you running this company at this time?
Yeah, I think there's a couple answers to that. I think everything in my background has led to this moment. And I think there's some pretty amazing kind of new enabling technologies right now that are creating the opportunity for big, bold breakthroughs in solving problems that we know that a lot of our user groups have. Yeah, this is the culmination of 25 years of thinking about this space and thinking about this user community. And I've worked in overhead imagery intelligence my whole life. So
take us back a few years. Give us the quick around the world of your background.
Yeah. So I started my career, worked my way through grad school at NASA Ames. So an incredible opportunity, a big organization, pretty slow moving organization. But NASA was kind of my first foray into working with folks in uniform, working with government customers, things like that. I was a software programmer back then, so programming a handful of things, including an airspace simulation for drones in the national airspace. This was back in the early 2000s, before any of that was kind of in the news, and any of that made sense to people. But working on that in the early 2000s, I spent a couple of years working at Lockheed Martin, so another very big organization, on a classified space-based project, and loved that work. So interesting, so technically sophisticated, but also it was one program that was going to go for the next decade. And I was in my mid-20s and just like I couldn't move at that pace.
Get a little antsy, yeah. Between the NASA and Lockheed, and so you jumped to.
So I jumped to this small startup called Insitu. Insitu at the time I joined was about 100 people, and definitely moved at a different pace. I remember, early on, the kind of chaos of a startup where sort of nothing works, but it's so exciting because you're getting to market for the first time, you're getting, product in front of users. And so it was a pretty exciting time. I started my first year at Insitu, led a kind of nose to tail overhaul of the major product there. It was called the Scan Eagle. That product went on to fly more than 1 million flight hours in direct
early
combat
UAV.
support around the world.
Pretty big drone.
Yeah, pretty popular, pretty widely used, a pretty important solution during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, during the global war on terror. Scan Eagle was there in a lot of stories, and so it was an amazing experience. Got to see company growth. Got to go through the process of Insitu being acquired into the Boeing company. So that was pretty fun. And briefly, Insitu was the highest producing by volume airplane producer within Boeing. So it was a nice feather in our cap. So we were doing some pretty amazing things there, doing some things that 15 years later, folks in the drone industry are describing as, first in the world. And shoot, we were doing them back in the 2000s. So it was a pretty exciting experience. It was with Insitu from about 100 employees. I left when there were 800 employees. So just this massive growth period. And over that period, saw drones go from being this kind of new technology that didn't really have a role to the point where our users were saying, hey, we are never going to go outside the wire without this capability. There's an expectation that every time we go on any kind of tactical mission, we're going to have pre-awareness of what we're doing based on overhead intelligence, and then we're going to have kind of live overhead during the operation. And so seeing that shift in the user group was pretty inspiring, showed me kind of the importance of what we were doing. And, 1 million flight hours, that's a lot. That's, you earn those kind of one at a time, but that was a lot of really exciting work. So yeah, Insitu was a great time. And then I had just this amazing other experience with a company that had spun out of Insitu that was acquired into another big defense prime. But at the time, it was a pretty small business called CloudCap Technology. CloudCap sold drone autopilots and drone video systems, video gimbal systems to like all of the other drones in the market. So we had something like 100 different clients using our drone autopilot. And it was an amazing experience because I got to see what everybody was doing across the market and got to hear all these trends, and really had a deep understanding of where the technology was, what the user demands were, what people wished was possible, but just wasn't, didn't seem like anybody was achieving yet. And so that was up until the beginning of 2016. 2016 was when NVIDIA was starting to be a kind of a household name with embedded sized GPUs. When AI was starting to be a little bit more of a household name with some of the work coming out of things like AlexNet and ImageNet. And so this insight that many of the folks that I knew in the drone industry were trying to solve this more kind of full-fledged, this richer autonomy problem. So the kind of the dirty secret in the drone world was drones weren't actually uncrewed at all. They often required more crew than traditional sources of intel, traditional, overhead aircraft, but there was just no people on them. So the kind of founding insight was if we could make image data collection systems that operated automatically, then we wouldn't need all of the crew to deal with the drones. And if we could get rid of the crew, then we could really ramp up the number of drones in the ecosystem and the impact that drones were making across the ecosystem. So that's kind of what got us started at Overwatch was figuring out, hey, could we figure out a way to automate the job that the drone is trying to do? Drones can kind of navigate themselves, but they can't accomplish anything at that point without people in the full-time, real-time loop. So figuring out how to automate that was kind of the founding principle. And basically that's still what we're working on today.
Thanks for that walkthrough. It is interesting to hear how insights working at, big companies and then startups informed kind of the challenge that you wanted to take on with Overwatch. When you talk about drone automation, there's a lot of areas that could have applied, but you focused on a specific use case, right? Specifically with wildfires, and talk to us about how that came about.
Yeah, sure. So in that time period, it's 8 or 9 years ago now, I was aware that a lot of drone companies who had supported operations in Afghanistan, had supported global war on terror, were thinking about what comes next. And so there was the sort of defense-oriented pivot to the Pacific. And that wasn't really clear yet what the drone role might be in a pivot to the Pacific. But the other major theme that was emerging was these drones have had such a major impact in the battle space, but are not really making an impact in civil roles. So law enforcement, emergency response, and wildfire management. So I live in the Pacific Northwest. It's an area where wildfires are a real threat all summer long, every year. And one of the big ideas was, well, shoot, we could put drones over wildfires and collect a lot better, a lot faster intelligence about what's going on in a wildfire, and that would dramatically improve the ability to fight the wildfire. So that was kind of the first project we tackled at Overwatch, was saying, well, okay, drones seem like they're a really powerful asset. Wildfires, that's a really important problem, and we see that the kind of end use agencies managing wildfires are spending a ton of money on responsive actions, fire suppression, but not really doing a great job getting ahead of the problem with better intelligence. And we saw there were some safety incidents. There were a couple loss of life incidents with wildland firefighters. And so all that led me to think, if we could figure out how to collect the right imagery intelligence, we could make the boots on the ground safer. We could make the agencies much, much more efficient. We could speed up the response, the suppression of wildfires. And so kind of everybody wins. But, that process started. I saw companies trying to do that exactly the same way they had done in a military ISR, tracking bad guys and tracking cars. And the insight there was like, well, that's not the kind of intel that's required for this job. This is more of finding a needle in a haystack, finding a small spot fire or a lightning strike started fire that's going to cause major damage, it's going to cause major growth over these very, very large areas. So the problem set was a little bit different, and the intelligence sensors, the full motion video systems that were being used on drones really weren't the right tool for that job, because they weren't collecting the right data, and because they required people to stare at them the whole time and then do this kind of verbal translation of visual perception, which is really hard for people when the things you're looking at is like, oh, there's a tiny fire in the forest. It's a very difficult scenario to describe with words. It's a much easier scenario to describe with digital data. We put a size and pins on a map to say, hey, here's exactly what's happening. And like this digital data packet can go to another aircraft, can go to ground users instantly. And that's, that can be really impactful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think it's a interesting set of insights. It's a problem that is significant and also very much a niche, right? It's not, I think most of us probably don't understand how firefighting happens generally, especially kind of in those environments. What were early conversations look like? What did they look like? Were you working with federal agencies? Were you working with state and local agencies? How do you get access to user groups dealing with that problem set?
A lot of this is very common to the defense and intelligence community. There's definitely an existing ecosystem, but sometimes hard to figure out how to get into. So, we took the same two approaches that we take now when we're working on building our business inside the defense and intelligence communities, which is twofold. One is there's key end users who need the solution. And we knew that we were making a part of a solution, but we were not intending to be a prime contractor. We were working on making imagery intelligence systems that could go on everything that flies. So the idea was, if we could, understand and inform the end users who would want this solution to happen, but then also we spent a lot of time working with prime contractors to say, hey, we've got this new piece of enabling technology. If we put this enabling technology on your drone, as an example, or on your aircraft, you would be far more efficient than folks who are doing it without our technology. And that kind of proved out to be true. So our first customers were all prime contractors on data service contracts who had this financial incentive and competitive incentive to be more efficient. And so they saw what we were doing and said, oh, well, that's 100 times more efficient than what we used to do. That allows us to reduce the number of people involved in staring at raw data. It allows us to deliver faster responses. It allows us to collect, more important data for the user. So we're giving the user what they want. That's just better in every way. So our first sales were to commercial companies, and they were commercial sales where we were providing product and getting paid for it. And we didn't entirely know, exactly what the prime contract details were. We didn't exactly know who the end users were. We had good awareness of kind of what the overall problem was, but we just started selling to users that could use the product to be better.
Especially in this world of federal sales and defense sales, it can be very tempting to only go direct, right? And think about the government end users as the only ones that you want to focus on. But I think using the relationships you built with primes to say, hey, we're going to focus on distribution too. We have this technology. How do we get it in the hands of the people who need it? Recognizing where folks had those contracts, you weren't necessarily going to upturn the apple cart and try to replace them in the stack, if you will. You were looking into how to make it in their interest to benefit from your technology.
And the experience I had prior to Overwatch was so impactful in that because, I was working with 100 different drone companies, so kind of I just felt to the core of my soul that the world didn't need another drone company. There are plenty of drones out there, but the problem was, 100% of them were using the wrong data collection techniques or, the wrong data processing for these kind of jobs that were more described as wide area search, finding a needle in a haystack, delivering digital data. Everybody was kind of taking this approach that was the same approach to tracking bad guys in Afghanistan. And, that just wasn't the right answer for these different scenarios. So yeah, we found a very eager customer base that was all one step removed from the government. It was folks that are on contracts with the government and, providing a service. And so the better they get at providing that service, the more efficiently they can provide it, the faster they can provide it, the better everybody does. So yeah, that was a great approach. It also got us integrated with all these companies, both drone companies and traditional aircraft, special mission aircraft service providers that were also trying to penetrate the defense market and also trying to work in law enforcement, also trying to work in intelligence. And so that community, the sort of aerospace and defense community, everybody's generally got the same ideas of like, hey, we make the best flying product. It ought to be in all these different scenarios where the goals are pretty similar. And so, yeah, that's the approach we've taken is, if we can be the supplier of choice of a capability to everybody who's bidding on a contract, then we're pretty confident that we'll end up winning the work. And the end agency customers can choose based on which prime contract or which, kind of aircraft is the best for the job. And we're there providing a common data answer, regardless of who that prime contractor is. So that's been our approach is kind of let's work with everybody. And then, no matter who wins the contract, we'll be part of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's an interesting approach. It's a good approach. It's a little bit different, again, than a lot of what we see. It's not the only way that you guys are different. Greg, you also chose to build a company right in the smack dab in the center of the defense hub of Oregon. Tell us about that choice.
Yeah. So, I moved to Hood River, Oregon to take a job with Insitu back in the mid 2000s and thought that would just be a couple year vacation, and it's a beautiful place to live. It's a adventure sports capital of the world. It's a beautiful fruit farming community, great access to skiing and mountain biking. It's just this amazing place to live. But I recognized it wasn't a kind of aerospace and defense hub. And so figured we would just be there for a few years, checking out this startup and see where that journey went. And yeah, 20 years later, I love the place I live. I love the community. I do feel this really strong sense of community. I see coworkers at the grocery store and see folks that work on other, airborne imaging systems at the grocery store and, out for a beer after work. Like every other table is filled by somebody who has been to Afghanistan with a drone or, it's like there's a lot of rich history in this little area. So Insitu did really well. Insitu helped create this community called the Gorge Tech Alliance. Gorge Tech Alliance, along with kind of just the spirit of the area, has led to a lot of spin outs and kind of entrepreneurial startups. So there is a really strong, rich set of companies there making airborne imaging products and kind of related carbon composites and electronics that are all serving mainly into the mid-sized drone industry. But, as time passes, the customer base kind of expands beyond that into into other parts of the ecosystem. So yeah, it's definitely a small town. Hood River is a city of population 10,000 or so. So I mean, it's a very small place. It's a beautiful place to live, and it's a place that I just love, being and spending my time. But it's also a place where there are, some of the best thinkers in the world, and these particular airborne imaging problems are all based there. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a perfect place in that sense.
So quite strategic in that way. And Greg, give us some sense. How big is your team and how many people are located in Oregon versus spread across the country?
Overwatch, we're 30 employees now. About 25 of us are fortunate enough to live in beautiful Hood River.
It's a pretty good number. Yeah, that's.
Yeah, we definitely have some folks based elsewhere. Over the past years, we've tried more and less with remote working and, with software engineering. A lot of our staff is software engineering. That works really, really well. With some of our business development, that works really well to have folks that are just in, closer proximity to customers. But for a lot of our core team, we found that the experience of just being together, getting to kind of put things on whiteboards, getting to talk over lunch and talk through problems as they arise has been really important. So most of the team and all of the core management team is based in Hood River.
Gotcha. So let's get into the story, Greg, about how you took the insights from the work you were doing in the fire and the EMS side of things and expanded into the federal and into the defense space. And, you had talked about the work you were doing to automate those full motion video gimbals and to create this kind of automated sensor operator pairing. But tell us a little bit about the insights that started to emerge from your work and then how you fed that forward into initial contact with the federal government.
Yeah, sure. So, a lot of it happened organically, and then it kind of accelerated from there. So the sort of organic background, I mentioned we were working with a couple drone providers that were doing this wildfire mapping. Many of them were also working on maritime awareness, maritime search and rescue contracts. And so we saw that problem set shared a common kind of technological core or technological nugget, which was, looking for a small signal in a large geographical area, and how computer vision systems and GPU processing and getting to use kind of embedded NVIDIA processors and, kind of machine learned models was just plain better than people watching a screen. It was more efficient, but it was just technically superior. We were able to find smaller things in bigger areas faster. And so as we started to talk to our drone customers about what else they were working on besides, wildfires, the idea of maritime search kept coming up. And we said, well, that's the same problem as looking for little spot fires that have gotten outside of a containment area. It's just looking for a needle in a haystack. And we happen to make technology that's really good for looking for a needle in a haystack from an aircraft. So we started making systems that were doing a maritime automated search, like an optical radar for finding things in water that are not water. That was, kind of major project or major endeavor number 2. And again, we grew a lot of really strong relationships with drone service providers out of that, with UAS companies. It also introduced us to the U.S. Navy and some international navies and Coast Guards as well, who were all working on this problem. And, like wildfires, the maritime search problem benefits from this idea that kind of everybody around the world is doing it more or less the same way. A person in water looks the same in the US as a person in water looks in Europe or in Australia. So, we were able to take that same solution and provide it to a lot of the different customers that we already knew, and they were able to turn around and take that to their contract, awardee or awarders, their customers, and say, well, hey, we've got this technology that makes the system more efficient, makes the system better, increases our safety, reduces the flight hours, makes everything more effective. Shouldn't we use that? And, the feedback was generally, yes, you should. So we were able to quickly integrate onto systems that were providing on service contracts. And then, from there, we sort of knew a bit of the kind of defense business development playbook. Said, okay, well, let's talk to those end customers. They probably should add this as a requirement so that, all of the providers are providing this because the end user has seen that this is a better way of getting the job done. So, started talking to end use agencies like the US Navy as an example, who said, well, sure, we should add this as a requirement. We agree. It makes it better. So, that was good. And that kind of locks us into some business and helps us find some more of those prime contract holders who are trying to compete and win that business. They're now, seeking us out to say, hey, we hear you make the best answer to this new requirement. Can we get one? Or, we'd like to include you in our proposal. So that was a really good way for us to start working in the defense ecosystem in a way that still felt very commercial, very, very natural to us, very organic. We were able to do that with a commercial business, a commercial accounting system. We were able to do it on our standard commercial terms and conditions. So it was a really great way to build a base of experience, build a team, build some product, repetitions. Like we got to know what worked and what didn't. We got to spend a lot of time out with customers who are using the product and see how the user experience was for them and how we can improve that. And we got to collect a ton of data. So we had systems flying in all these relevant areas doing relevant work. And we were collecting a lot of that data so that we could keep training machine learned models and have the best models out there. So it was this kind of increase in flywheel. So then there's a second part of the story, though, which is somewhere along the way we raised some venture capital. And that was a great story, but maybe a different story.
Well, so let's pause there for a second, because I think this is an important story as you think about, and then we'll dive into that second part. But with the traction you'd had in the emergency management space, the response space, and then some of these initial touch points with the government, talk us through the decision to say we're going to go the venture route. What did that entail? What were the trade-offs, and how did you ultimately get to yes?
I think it's a confluence of a whole bunch of different factors. So, this is sort of funny times in the world. We went through kind of COVID shutdown, and then we went through like interest rate, major changes, and all that sort of just affected the business in different ways, affected what we were able to do, affected the customers we were able to reach over a certain period of time. And so, that was one, just sort of like changing financial conditions in aerospace and defense in general. In the early 2020s, we started to see a lot more interest in defense tech from the venture capital community. And so we had one strategic investor partner since 2019. We'd always talked about expanding into defense was a path we thought we would go to grow our business and kind of keep increasing the impact of the work we were doing. But we knew that we needed to make the systems, a little bit different, a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit better to really penetrate the defense use cases that we were working on. So that led us to this interest in saying, well, hey, we think we've found a model that's working really well. We've been growing this commercially oriented business in a really capital efficient way. What if we kind of stepped on the gas a bit and built it out a bit faster around this thesis that the technology that we've built and proven around this wildland fire use case would also be very applicable inside of a lot of other tactical defense use cases. So that was really the goal with our initial venture fundraise, was take the work that we'd done in the civil space and apply it into the defense space. And we already had great connections into the sort of drone prime contract level. And so now we just had to sort of make the product right for that market. We had to get our requirements, made aware to the folks writing requirements inside the government. We had to get out there and do some more demos. But we thought, let's do it. That all makes a lot of sense. And turns out though that the defense ecosystem doesn't move as fast as a small venture-backed company can move. And our business model at the time was based on selling a new piece of hardware, which generally was sold onto a new aircraft. So we were selling a sensor whenever one of our drone service providers was bringing a new aircraft online. And we were also selling onto traditional piloted aircraft, which, are even more sort of infrequently added to the fleet. And so we saw that we had this, kind of a dampener on our growth rate because we were only selling new sensors when new aircraft came online. And so, one of the major insights that our board had, our investors had, shortly after we raised our Series A venture round, was this idea that, well, we make a technology that makes all these sensors more efficient. It's generally software based, but we've been taking it to market in the form of a sensor, in the form of hardware that goes onto an aircraft. What if we just partnered with companies that are already selling the hardware onto lots more aircraft in the defense space at scale? We could just bring them our unique benefit, which is kind of our automation software, and we would have access to this much, much bigger market. And, that would again be like everybody wins. The end user gets access to technology faster that makes them safer and more efficient. The operators, the kind of drone service providers, are happy to be providing what their customer needs and are happy to be staying at the technological cutting edge. The camera makers, sensor makers, we're happy to have a solution that included artificial intelligence and, included a path to much greater autonomy. And we were happy to have access to, a much bigger market that was serving missions that we thought were really important. So yeah, we started this idea of the ASO software product, the automated sensor operator software that operates on third-party systems, based on this awareness that, we think it's this automation technology that's really important and really creating an impact for end users. And maybe the best way to get that out there is by getting it onto all the sensors that are already out there and getting it onto the sensors that are getting sold at scale already across the ecosystem.
Totally. So if I could summarize, that's almost this decision to go platform agnostic and say, hey, we're going to be a software layer that can be a little bit more extensible. We're gonna not pick a horse. We're going to try to make our stuff more broadly available. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's a great characterization. I think another insight I had along the way, talked to some folks at very, very big defense primes, who are some of the world leaders in making airborne imaging systems, and described what we were doing to them, and described our software, but also described our hardware, and saw sort of this, this pulling back, this like bristling or, hairs raising on the neck from these big defense primes. He said, like, well, what? That's what we make. So, like, you're not going to make what we make, or if you're making what we make, then we're not going to talk to you anymore. So, okay, that's an interesting insight. Like, we don't really want to just compete head to head with the biggest defense primes in the world. That doesn't seem like a great recipe for kind of a startup at our size and scale. And we also thought that, it'd be better to work in a space where really the thing we were competing with was this precious resource that wasn't, didn't have these kind of market leaders, but it was an area where all of the government agencies, but especially the Department of Defense, was having a major problem, which was just staff, just crewing these systems, putting image analysts and sensor operators into the roles. So we saw, the Air Force was really struggling with its recruiting goals. Army was really struggling with its recruiting goals, the Navy. And, how could we address that? We could address that by really solidly focusing on the automating work part of the problem, rather than making, another sensor that still requires crew in the loop to do the operation. So we see us as really, trying to augment the team, augment the force. So like acting as more of a force multiplier and less as a sensor. So yeah, so then that, once we were there, we said, well, let's work with all the sensors and we can just be the force multiplier part that allows those sensors to operate autonomously.
Definitely. If you reflect, Greg, on the strategy and kind of where you are, we've talked about multiple valleys, right? There's not one binary, we're across the valley, we're good. Give us kind of your honest take on where Overwatch is in this journey from, okay, we've got this idea, let's prototype it, to this idea is accepted at scale by mission owners and mission doers, mission operators, kind of throughout the enterprise. Where's Overwatch on that spectrum, and what is the next kind of step for the company to take?
I mean, we are definitely still crossing the valley. Noah, I appreciate the name of your podcast here. We're definitely still working there. We have a technology that we've demonstrated in lots of different use cases and gotten very positive feedback from users. And so, we know what the future will bring, but getting there is tricky. A lot of times adding our technology even onto a third-party sensor gets tied to a new contract award. And new contract awards, sometimes take years to compete and down select and potentially recompete, and then get fielded and tested and integrated. So, a lot of times we have 2 or 3 year long sales cycles. So for a company with startup DNA, a 2 or 3 year long sales cycle is a really tough way to work. But you piece enough of those together and you can start building a solid sales pipeline and solid book of business. But yeah, we're definitely still in the making a market stage with this ASO software. I've loved that we've gotten to run our business in parallel with this AI revolution over the past couple of years. Competing with the capabilities of humans is really hard, right? Humans are good at a lot of things, and humans are also the decision makers, and so we're kind of biased towards the processes that humans take. And so, in some ways, we think of what we're making is a competitor to the human sensor operator. That's the place where we're able to provide the force multiplication. We're able to allow small teams to not dedicate a person to heads down looking at a screen, but instead do kind of other more, physically present, parts of the mission. So as we are working to do the job of humans, the bar that we're compared to is quite high. We start off by saying, well, hey, we can automatically detect when things are on fire. And, users will come back to us with just the most nuanced questions of like, okay, well, what about this scenario? And describe just this extremely complex scenario. And then, after talking for a minute about this extremely complex scenario, just like, so can you automate that? It's like, well, like not right away. We cannot.
Straight to the edge cases, right?
Definitely we could at some point. But, this year we were thinking more like, just doing the really boring parts of the job where, like you're just looking at endless streams of data. Like everybody forgets that part and they remember, the exciting car chase at the end of the movie or whatever. But it's like, well, yeah, most of the time was spent just doing this really boring, cognitively intense job of kind of looking for a target in a sea of not targets. So anyways, trying to compete with the human sensor operator has been tough. We are winning over kind of hearts and minds of users from our operational work, from demos that we do. We are starting to win more and more buy-in from government program offices who are trying to figure out how to do more with less. And that's a key theme that our technology really addresses is how can teams do more with less? So we're pretty squarely aligned to that kind of thematic point. But yeah, it's a slow process for sure, getting government agencies to adopt new technology, adopt automation, adopt artificial intelligence at the edge. It's a slow process for sure.
No, absolutely. If you take a step back, Greg, and just kind of think about the journey you've been on and kind of the road you're still traveling, what's your take on kind of the current vibe of the defense technology industry? We have much more venture capital interest today. You mentioned in your story today in 2024, there's accelerating kind of international conflicts. There's really, it feels like kind of a technological wave of progress that just seems to be moving. I don't know, maybe we're all biased, but whether it's the rate of AI acceleration, whether it's the recently announced, okay, now seem to maybe be having quantum computing breakthroughs. It just seems like wave after wave of technological advancement. What do you think it all means for this industry?
Yeah, a couple different things. One is the customers have to move faster. Agencies have to move faster to adopt new technologies. It does certainly seem, I agree with you, that there's a technology wave happening that is pretty quickly changing the priorities in the battle space and the priorities in the inventory. I think Ukraine has been the best example of that, of just like the rapid pace of adoption of new technology and how that sort of cat and mouse game around drone warfare in Ukraine has kind of spilled over to the U.S. defense industrial base and planners of future conflict that, in the U.S. So, I think the idea that we need to move faster at adopting new technology, I think that's one. I think there's an interesting shift going on backed by big venture capital backed companies of really taking on the major defense primes or the traditional primes. So I think that's a kind of interesting kind of adjacent trend is, will the first names that people think of in the defense ecosystem 10 years from now, it's not clear that they'll be the same names that people thought of 5 years ago. So I think that's really interesting to see companies built in the past few years and built around kind of software first, connected world first, autonomy, edge processing, all these things. And companies built with that as their core DNA requires different skill sets, requires different people. And so, I think the kind of big new venture-backed defense tech companies, I think are really changing the game. And it's not clear how that's all going to play out yet. But I think that's a really interesting kind of trend. And they're certainly like moving the needle on the vibe in the industry about what's important. That said, it's still true that the vast majority of defense spending is going to things that were bought 5 years ago. So the vast majority of spending is going to crew, to people. Even then within the, just the acquisition and sustainment parts of the budget, vast majority is going to sustainment of systems that have been bought for decades, or technologies that have been in production for many years, or even ideas that were conceived 10 years ago that are just now getting to procurement. So you still see the vast majority of defense spending going to more traditional ideas. And so it's interesting to see if that'll shift. There was a Replicator was a really interesting kind of thought piece around that in the past year or so of kind of the Office of Secretary of Defense leading with the idea that we're going to spend $1 billion on this, which to the kind of drone industry felt great, felt like a lot of kind of validation of the work. But then you think, well, shoot, out of a nearly $900 billion budget, $1 billion going to one of the major new factors on the battlefield. If you look at hotspots around the world, like, that doesn't actually seem like that much at all. So, I think that's going to be interesting to watch with a new administration. Going to be interesting to watch over the next couple of years to see the shift in defense spending and kind of how fast that moves. And then finally, just new tech adoption. I think, the pace of commercial technology advancement with edge compute, with AI, with processing, with communications technology, with data storage has so vastly changed the commercial world that we operate in. And I don't think that's all kind of trickled down into the defense ecosystem yet. And then certainly to go back to our roots, like it absolutely has not trickled down into kind of the civil roles that could benefit from the exact same technology. So I'm eager to see the kind of pace of technology adoption, and hopeful, but nervous that we'll kind of be forced to adopt new technologies very quickly if any kind of new conflicts break out. So that's my take on it. There's a lot of like worry about how fast things are changing, but also like a need to get on board with that fast change.
The reality is crisis is the kind of mother of necessity. And I think until we face these challenges until they become real, there's not that burning platform for our large, bureaucratic institutions to adapt. And so hopefully that's a silver lining in all of this, is the pressure that you're feeling and others are feeling is maybe going to help spur this thing on. Greg, as we move to close here, one more question for you, which is looking back at the journey you've been on and the decisions you've made about the company every step. What's something that you wish you knew starting out that today, that one of the hard-won lessons of the last number of years?
Oh, gosh. Yeah. I mean, that everything moves slower than desired, and that changing the way work gets done for users is hard, is slow. That's certainly been one major lesson learned. We've really coalesced around the idea lately that the biggest job we are solving as a company right now is that we need to make a market for our technology, for our ASO, automated sensor operator software. We're making a market for that. And so, we continuously, focus internally, because we're kind of born out of engineering roots and we're born as a product development company. We always talk about the technology. We always talk about, what's the next test we're going to run? What's the next product iteration we can implement? We're still not talking enough about making the market and, finding our way to get our technology out to the people that need it. So, definitely that's a lesson that I'm still learning, is increasing the focus on, that going to market piece, because the kind of natural pace of new technology adoption is kind of slow. So those have been, some tougher lessons learned. I think on the bright side, I very intentionally built a company where we talk a lot about supporting missions that matter. We talk a lot about making a big impact with our work. And that's had a really positive effect on the team that we've built and the passion that that team brings to our work. So I think that's one, really exciting positive lesson that, I'll take with me to every job I do is like, if you're working on something important and if the team that's working on it feels passionate about it, then that team produces so much more, feels so much more committed to the work. And, that plays out in just a whole lot of different positive ways. So yeah, so focusing on missions that matter, I think is a great lesson.
And that's a great place for us to end, Greg. I really appreciate you taking this time and being so generous with your insights here. For anybody who might be interested in learning more about Overwatch, maybe even joining the team, joining the mission, what's the best way for them to learn more about you?
Yeah, so we keep a pretty active LinkedIn page going. So definitely give us a follow on LinkedIn. We're posting a couple times a week with product samples and kind of imagery examples of processing that we're doing. So even if you're not thinking about joining our company, I think it's a really interesting. I just enjoy looking at the things we're posting. It's just like always interesting imagery intelligence scenarios. Our website keeps a list of open jobs, and so we do have a couple jobs that we're getting ready to post pretty soon. As we're continuing to grow our capacity. So that's us. And then, eventually look for us on everything that flies.
Love that. All right. We'll link to the website and to the LinkedIn in the show notes. Greg, thanks again for taking the time. Best of luck out there. We'll be watching.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.